Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for joining us today. This is the kickoff to a series that we have this week. It's called Minorities in STEM, and this is a career exploration series. And we have two amazing speakers today. The moderators are going to be two of our new leader program participants. So, Kiara, I'm going to pass it over to you to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you, Annabelle. So first, I just want to say, I know some people are joining us from West Coast, some East Coast. So good morning if you're on the West Coast, and I guess lunchtime if you're on the East Coast, but thank you for joining us. If you're able to, we do ask for you to turn on your camera just to be able to engage, the speakers can see you. And then when we get to the question and answer session, we will be monitoring the chat, but you're also welcome to raise your hand, and we'll call on you to ask questions. So today I have the privilege to introduce our first speaker, but I do want to mention that we are joined, both speakers are CCST fellows. So I just want to emphasize how important it is they know each other. So always keep in mind your professional network. So that is something very, very important. And then the first speaker today is Dr. Renita Polk. She is currently the Deputy Director for Aging, Disability, and Older Adult Services. So I wanted to invite her because she's really a great reflection of how you use your science training to impact community. And she'll get more into her career journey. So I will turn it over to Dr. Polk to tell us a little bit more about what she does, and how she got to the position she's currently in.
Thanks, Kara. Good morning / good afternoon, everyone. Like Kara mentioned, my name is Renita Polk. So I started kind of my science policy journey. I have a PhD in genetics and molecular biology from Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. And probably about halfway through grad school, I started thinking about, what was going to happen after, and realized that I didn't want to stay in academia. And so I was trying to figure out ways that I could apply the science and things that I've learned beyond the lab bench. And so I began that transition. I applied to the California Council on Science and Technology Policy Fellowship. And that's also how I met our other speaker, Dr. Lashe Kavli, through that program. And so in that program, I was assigned to an office of a member of the California legislature, Dr. Mike, or he's not a doctor, sorry, Mike Gibson. But and so in that office, I staff worked on legislation, and I led hearings on public health issues. And so since that time, I've worked in different areas of state government. I worked in the legislature for the California State Senate Budget Committee. I also worked at the California Department of Aging, where I led a workforce initiative there. And then now I'm the Deputy Director of Aging, Disability, and Older Adult Services at the County Welfare Directors Association. And I lead legislative and budget work advocating for aging and disability services. And so even though county is in the name of the organization that I work for, I'm not a county government employee. I actually work at the state level advocating on behalf of all of the 58 counties in California. So I'm really looking forward to speaking more with you all today and hearing your questions and trying to hopefully be helpful to you all. But I'm glad to be here.
Thank you so much for sharing a little bit about your career journey. So I just, before we jump into questions, I want to pass it over to my fellow NSPN leader, um, PS Nandini. She'll introduce our second speaker.
Hello everyone, I'm PS Nandini. I'm also one of the NSPN Leaders Cohort participants, and I'm really happy to welcome our second panelist, Dr. Lashe Koble. She finished her PhD in biology from the University of Utah, where she studied the interactions between humans and the nitrogen cycle in the urban ecosystems. And then she was a science policy fellow at the CCST, where she was placed at the California Air Resources Board, and she continues to work there, and she's currently now an air resources supervisor at the California Air Resources Board. I found it very interesting that her research and her current work tie in together, so I wanted to ask her more about how she figured out that this would be the best transition and how her science skills are helping her in her current work. So I'm very happy and honored to welcome her to our panel today. And I would like her to tell us more about her career.
Happy to. Good morning, everybody. So grateful that you guys have your pictures on. It's so much easier to talk to faces than to black boxes with names. So thank you. Also, like, shout out to UPS. Like, I literally got a new job yesterday, like actually yesterday. And the fact that you knew my new title just means that you're on it. Like, wow. Um, so as she mentioned, my PhD is in biology. I'm from New York City, which is like the concrete jungle. So the fact that I like ended up studying trees and now studying air quality is just wild to me. I will say that my path was not linear, but it was always intentional. And so every time that I made a move, I spent a fair amount of time doing research and trying to learn what it was like on the ground often, so that when I made that move, even if it was scary, right, going from low income Brooklyn, New York to Utah to then California, right? Like those were big moves for me, but every time I made sure to talk to as many people as I could to make that blow as easy as possible. So from, I guess undergrad is decades ago at this time, but like for my PhD program, I was studying tree leaves, and I was the only person of color. I shouldn't say that. I was the only Black woman in my program. And so I did not want my story to be, my research to be related to environmental justice at all. I just wanted to have numbers and be like, look, scientists, be objective about my work. But the data didn't lie. It told me this story about pollution. I was trying to figure out where my trees got their nitrogen from, and it was the story about pollution. And as I was talking to, and specifically pollution in lower income neighborhoods in the cities that I was studying, and as I spoke to my PI, I was like, okay, so what are we going to do about this? And she was like, you're going to publish. And I was like, okay, but now that we're published, what are we going to do about it? And she was like, you're going to ask more questions and you're going to publish some more. And I was just like, that it didn't quite sit well with me. I wanted to do something about what I was measuring. And so that's when I found CCST. I think fellowships are a great way to sort of get your foot in the door and try and figure things out. However, what I've learned is if you don't have access to a fellowship, or if you don't get in, there are still ways to make that transition through having a strong network and talking to people, which I can get more into how to utilize your network as questions come. But I did CCST and I was placed at the California Air Resources Board. It's kind of interesting because I didn't want to necessarily do work that was related to my PhD. I was kind of burnt out on academia and burnt out on that topic, but sometimes the universe knows better than you do, and they put you in the place that you need to be. And I needed to be at CARB, and it was incredible. I got to work on everything from the advanced clean fleets regulations, so working on heavy duty trucks, talking to engineers and community members. And then I moved to the world of air toxics, still within CARB. I like working at a big organization because it means that if I get restless, I can still change topics, but in a very safe space in a world that I'm still familiar with. And so I went from working on trucks to working on air toxics, and then loved it even more and realized for me that making change means not only leading projects, but also leading people. And then that's when I went into management, and I am 24 hours into management, so I can't tell you guys what that part's like, but I'm pretty stoked on it. That's me.
Well, thank you both for sharing and introducing yourself and telling us about your amazing careers. I think something that I took away from hearing from both of you is really that you were both interested in how your PhD training translated to impacting others and your community more so than what you could just do standing behind the bench. So, as an early career scientist, sometimes it can be hard to see the path forward to that translation. So, I was curious how you guys went about the transition, what sparked it, and how you navigated that transition. So we'll start with Dr. Polk and then we'll go to Dr. Cobley.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So yeah, you're absolutely right. When I was in grad school, I started to wonder kind of how my work in the lab could connect more directly with the public. And specifically, I felt this disconnect between the work that I was doing and kind of having a broader societal impact. I just felt like, yeah, I'm publishing these papers and that's great, but who's gonna read these? Was kind of how I felt. Um, and so that kind of led me to investigate paths that were not in academia. And I will say, I didn't really have any knowledge or exposure of like science policy or policy really. I had no idea what went into that. Luckily, my PI had done some work. He was, and I don't actually remember exactly what it was, but the lab that I worked in, we did research using a mouse model of Down syndrome. So we studied different genetic um, impacts of Down syndrome. And so my PI had worked with the state legislature on some legislation dealing with scientific research, and then also some different work dealing with disability services, and specifically like looking at Down syndrome. And so through conversations with him, I was like, oh, this policy thing sounds kind of interesting. How do I get into that? And thankfully, I had a very uh, supportive PI who said, you know what, I have no idea how to help you get into this, but I have a friend that works in science communications and maybe they can help you. And so he gave me her phone number. And I called her, talked to her, and then so she kind of helped me get started and connected me with other people. And I began doing a lot of informational interviews. So I talked to people that like a couple of science writers. I talked to some folks that like worked in science museums doing communication that way, some folks in science policy. So it was a broad range of things because at the time I was like, I have no idea what I want to do. I just know I don't want to stay in academia. Um, and so that was kind of helped start that transition. And I then that kind of led me to the science policy nonprofit, the Institute for Science and Global Policy. And kind of one of the things that I really had to do was step outside of my comfort zone, which being a huge introvert, I was like, I don't want to talk to people. That's just like uncomfortable, but I had to do it. um, And one of, so the Institute for Science and Global Policy is this science policy nonprofit that they put on these conferences, and they invite policymakers from different levels of state government and scientists to come talk about their work to all of these policymakers, and kind of how science can really inform policymaking. And I just found this group through like a Google search, looked up some of their conferences, seemed really interesting. And I just like went to their contact information on their website and emailed them. And I was like, hey, I'm interested in science policy. Like, can I volunteer? And they were like, great. So I worked with that group for a couple of months. And I went to a couple of their conferences, helped plan some of the conferences for them. Um, and that was really helpful in kind of learning about the policymaking process. And I saw how scientific evidence can shape legislation, and also how critical it was to translate that into a language and into a narrative that resonates with policymakers and the public. Um, and so I feel like I've been talking for a long time, so I will stop there. But yeah, if later folks have questions or want me to expand more on that, I can.
Dr. Polk, we'll let you go ahead, and I'll just ask this next question, and then we'll shift it over to Dr. Cobley. But in addition to what you've already shared, what's any additional things advice you would give to young scientists as they're kind of shifting into the policy landscape at either the local or the state level?
Yeah. So one thing I will say, which I think is definitely evident in my journey, that you don't have to have it all figured out to get started. Just being curious about different paths, and talking to people is great. I also I kind of did a little bit of science communication work too. I volunteered at the Smithsonian Museum. This is when I was on the East Coast, in the DC area, um, which was so much fun. Still like thinking back, it was great. Um, and so that kind of got me some practice learning how to communicate kind of complex scientific information to a variety of audiences. And so just kind of learning about different things, I think, is always helpful. And that is informing my work to this day. Don't underestimate the value of your scientific training, and being able to articulate how that training can be useful in a policy environment. When I started my fellowship in the legislature, there were some folks that worked in the legislature. Like when I told them, oh, like I have a PhD in genetics, and they're like, so did you just like waste the last 5 years of your life? Um, and so I had to kind of explain to them that no, that wasn't a waste, even though like I'm not in a lab doing experiments right now. A lot of the skills that I learned during that time, how to think critically, how to analyze data, solve problems, all of that is incredibly valuable in a policy setting. Um, and I would say seek out kind of communities and mentors. Um, I think, and I don't want to speak for Lashe, but I think she would say that after this webinar is over, folks want to reach out to me and they have more questions or just want to learn more, I'm more than happy to talk to anyone about kind of my journey, things like that. And networking and networks are extremely helpful and useful in this setting, in this world. I got my first job in state policy was through kind of a network. The executive assistant in the office that I applied in for the job was best friends with the executive assistant in the office that I did my fellowship in. And so when she saw that I worked in that office on my resume, she asked her friend, and her friend was like, "Oh, yeah, Renita's great." So just kind of going an example of how networks and just knowing folks can be really useful. So yeah, those are a couple of things that I would say to folks. Just, you don't need to have it all figured out. Don't underestimate the value of your scientific training in a policy environment. Seek out communities, seek out mentors who can help you and who understand that journey, which I think just by being here and attending this webinar is a great step in that journey. So I will stop there.
Yeah, thank you so much. And again, like just emphasizing the networking piece and building your network. Both of our speakers here today, if you missed it earlier, are both CCST fellows. And so they met each other through that. And as you can see, it kind of came full circle, and we have them both here today as panelists. So I just want to shift it over to Dr. Cobley, and just in addition to building your network, how would you say you would advise us to get started in policy, no matter what career level we're at?
Yeah, so great question. Also, Bernita took I have some points to make sure you hit this, and this, all of them have already been said. So thanks for making it a lot easier. But practical tips. So whatever topic you're interested in, there's probably an agency that works on that topic, right? And so once you figure out what agencies at whatever level, whether it's state level, local level, international, right? You have your topic area, you have your level, look at agencies. Agency websites will have the classification. So in government, people have classifications that you get into. There's usually exams associated with that classification. So once you figure out, and the agency website will say on their job page, opportunities page, I'm sure you guys have all seen it, you'll see the different titles and you'll be able to read the different descriptions of them. Usually, more often than not, they will have things called technicians are usually ways to entry points. Student assistants are usually entry ways to do it. So once you look for those things, those are your ways to get your foot in the door. I think it is controversial on whether or not folks will just take anything to see how the organization works. And so I would say work with your mentor and talk to people who work there to figure out if it is a right fit for you. But student positions are a great way, paid way to get access to an organization. And then once you're in an organization, I think oftentimes we feel like our next move has to be the career defining move, right? I wanted when I first left CCST for that job to be the job. But hopefully we have long careers, right? And my next job wasn't supposed to be the job. It was instead supposed to be the job that helped me figure out the landscape, right? Because I didn't know anything about policy. To think that in 1 year I would have figured out what my dream job was just setting me up for failure, right? So I was like, is this next position that I'm going to get, again, being intentional, is this next position going to help me figure out the landscape so that I can figure out what I want to do next? And when I say landscape, to me, a lot of being an adult and having a career is creative problem solving, which Renita talked about a lot, right? So for me, it's if I'm going to work on climate change or if I'm going to work on air quality issues, what role do I want to play while solving that problem, right? Academics are problem solving as well. They just play the role that I did not want to play, right? For me, I wanted to be on the regulatory team, right? I wanted to be the one creating the rules. That's hard because young activist Lashe is girl, being the regulator is not being the activist, right? Those are very different roles. So figure out what role you want. And one way to do that is for your next step when you're in that career to be who's in the room having these conversations? How are they pushing? Are they pushing the way that I want to be pushing? Do I want to be advocating in this way? Do I want to sit in this chair, right? the roles that you get, whether that's a student, whether that is an entry-level position, whether that's a manager, is just trying to figure out what role you want to play in problem solving.
I think that's really good. So I guess in addition to like problem solving skills and kind of going with the flow is something you learned during PhD training. So in addition to that, what do you think some skills are that has translated to help you where you are currently?
I promise you this is going to sound so basic, but it is how I sold myself for every job that I have had post grad school, is that I know how to think, I know how to write, I know how to read, and I know how to talk. That sounds so basic, but it's so true. Like people want to know that you're going to be able to like independently get the job done, but also collaborate with other people. And the way you do that is you think, you write, and you speak. Like it's not more complex than that. You can put fancy words to it, right? Like you can sell it in other ways, but like it's really that basic. If you hand me anything, whether it's written in legalese or it's written in scientific jargon, whatever rolls in, I'm gonna be able to figure it out and I'm gonna be able to take it to the next level because I can read, I can write, and I can think, right? And communicate it to other people and talk. So you get all of that through your PhD program. You just get there faster than other people. We don't got to complicate things.
And then Dr. Polk, is there any skills that you think you've been able to take from your PhD training that has helped you with getting to where you are currently?
Yeah, so yeah, ditto to what Dr. Cobley just mentioned. But just kind of like an example that might be a little helpful for you all. So in my previous role, when I worked at the Department of Aging, I oversaw a grant program and it was a pilot program. And so one of the things that we had to do was look at, because this is the pilot program, looking at outcomes, looking at data to determine if the program was successful and if it could be expanded statewide. So one of the things that was useful from my scientific training in that role was knowing the right questions to ask to determine if this program was successful or not. I think a lot of times in the state programs and things, especially working providing services to people, which is a lot of the programs that I work with, they just look at, oh, how many people did this program serve? Which is not necessarily a good measure of if the program was successful. So some of the things that I was looking at, not just how many people did this program serve, but what were the outcomes? Did this improve their health or things like that? So just kind of an example of how, having that research background, knowing how to analyze data, knowing how to think critically, and knowing what questions to ask was really helpful in my role now in policy. So just a couple of additional things that I'd add.
Yeah, so I definitely want to make sure we leave time to questions from everyone in attendance. But before we do that, I do want to throw one last question your way. I was curious, how did you guys figure out whether you wanted to work locally at the state level versus federal? And did you have any experience in the federal level? And did that make your decision to stay state or local any different? We can start with Dr. Polk.
Okay. Yeah, so I'd say when I kind of started in the state government role, I didn't have any experience either on kind of the federal level or local level. So I'll say when I started out, I wasn't set on, I want to work at the state level. It just kind of happened that way. But I will say, now that I know a little more, I will say I enjoy working at the state level, but I think it kind of depends on what you want your role to be. So for example, even though currently I work at the state level, I work with a lot of local county governments. And so working with them, I kind of get a taste of, the implementation work, kind of the boots on the ground work. You could say that a lot of the kind of local government does, which is not in a lot of different areas. That's not really what you do at the state level. The state level is more kind of overseeing and kind of making that policy that guides how the implementation happens, but you're not actually implementing those policies. So I think if you're interested in kind of like the implementation of policy, then I think more that local level is better. But if you're more interested in designing the policy around how that implementation happens and guiding that implementation, then I think state level is more for you. And I'll be honest, I don't have any experience working at the federal level, which is kind of what I always thought I would end up doing. I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area, so like everyone around me worked for the federal government. But, just don't have to get into it here, but the way things are at the federal level, I would say that likely I will stay working for the state government. Right now, don't have a desire to move to federal government, but things could change. So I'll say I have more knowledge of local and state and kind of how things work in that area, but not much about federal. So I can't answer that, but definitely have thoughts on state and local government. So.
And then Dr. Cobley, same question to you. Was there one factor that maybe made you choose state or local versus federal? And did you ever consider federal?
Yeah, I always keep my eye out on Fed stuff just because one, it just impacts my work, and two, my family's on the East Coast and I'm on the West Coast, and so it can be my ticket back east. I think it is hard during this administration. Um, and so I always keep my eyes to the ground because, again, the job you have right now is not the job you'll necessarily have forever. And so I always keep my eye out. The thing that keeps me here, and the thing that will probably keep me here for longer, is that when I look at the impact of the kind of work that I want to do, it is mostly happening in California, and it is mostly happening at the state level. When I think about the policies that are making real change, there are some local agencies that are doing it for sure, especially for us, because some of our local agencies still impact 8 million people, right? If you're like in LA County, for example. And so for me, it's what level of impact do I want to make, and which agencies are allowing me to do that? And for my world, I'm not saying this is true for every topic area, but for my world, that is happening in California at the state level. So that's why I'm here. I think some people really like that immediate, like, if I do this thing today, it is impacting someone else tomorrow, and they like seeing that. And for me, I think that more so happens at the local level. It's less likely to happen at the state level. And I think one of the things that's hard about state work is that there can be a problem that's really local, and you're like, I want to help, like this is going to impact people, but the truth is that it falls to a different agency. It doesn't happen. But the thing that I like is that when we do put something into effect, you're like, look at how many people this is going to impact in 10 years or 15 years. Like, I'm okay with that kind of win. And so to Renita's point, like being really honest with yourself at what level and how quickly do you need to see your wins? Because it's all pros and cons. So I would say I like state work now. It might not always be state work.
No, I think that's important to keep in mind as we're moving forward. We do have some time. I want to leave plenty of time for questions and answers from everyone who's able to join us today. So if you're able to, please raise your hand and I will call on you, and I'll also look through the chat. But it looks like the first hand raise we have is from Amanda. So if you can unmute yourself and then ask your question.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Dr. Polk and Dr. Cobley. Thank you for spending time with us today. I am a postdoc and I'm kind of after on the job market now. And so my expertise is in plant science and plant biology, but I'm finding that many jobs in policy emphasize things like ecology, or they're more on like the health side. So beyond just emphasizing that PhD training is broad and that we're analytical thinkers and we have those skills, how would you recommend, marketing myself specifically, but everyone for a job in a field where they, are looking for buzzwords and screening CVs and throwing things out? If you don't say like, I already have experience in ecology, but I'm a molecular plant biologist, or, those little kind of tricks.
Couple things. One, so for every job you apply to, it has like a duty statement or like the job ad. Pull words from that job ad, right? So like fresh out of literally studying tree leaves, homegirl on my interview panel was like, "Why do you care about heavy duty trucks?" And I'm like, "Lady, I know nothing about heavy duty trucks." But the way that my brain spent it in that moment is like I cared about urbanization, right? Like I cared about trees in cities specifically, right? And then so I sold the urbanization aspect of it. Like you don't have to get locked into sort of the buzzwords that you use in academia. You can like sort of zoom out to systems thinking, right? And so it's like, does that kind of help with what you're saying? Yeah, and just like use the job ad for buzzwords.
Yeah, and I just did a little heart emoji. Hopefully that was signifying that I agree with everything that Lashe said, and I don't have anything else to add. So
Okay,
Also,
so
jumping in, you commented, Dr. Polk, on your network. So sometimes it's network if it doesn't match.
okay, let's see. It looks like we have a hand raise from Kate. So Kate, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Sure. I don't know if Olivia was first. I know sometimes it like does that, but I'll take my opportunity. But my question is, I'm somebody who now lives in a red state and who's interested in working in local and state government, and my background's in environmental health and policy. I did a master's of public health. And with the current administration, but also with like a growing, like prior to this current administration, a growing distrust in terms like environmental justice and health equity, I'm curious if you have ideas about how to navigate wanting to work in policy and a government level and like around compliance or regulation while trying to like all of my background in research says like environmental justice or environmental health or health equity in it. And so how to like kind of market that because unfortunately the reality is like those words are like you're too much of an activist thing right now. So sorry, that wasn't very succinct, but thank you.
Read. I have thoughts, but you can go if you want to add to it. So I think a couple of things. One, think about the environment that you're getting into. If those buzzwords are things that make that organization uncomfortable and they're not doubling down on it, is that a place you want to work for? I think is a real question to ask yourself because you might be frustrated doing the work there. I think doing this work now, I mean, it's always frustrating to do this work, right? But I think doing this work now can be especially frustrating. So you want to make sure that the agency that you land with has an appetite for the type of work and the level at which you want to do that work. DEI is not going away. I don't know where where you're from, but in California, right, it's like if our job of many agencies is to help those most impacted, and those most impacted are people of color, then they're gonna be doing this work regardless of whether or not they say
Oh,
that title. And so it's a matter of, I think, reading enough between the lines when you're talking to folks at that agency to see if you're comfortable doing the work there.
yeah. So I'm in Atlanta, just for context.
Okay.
So like the people here are into it, but then they can't get funded if they use it. So it is a lot of like reading between the lines. Like the state doesn't want to fund it, but yeah, it's a whole other thing.
Yeah, and just to add to that, so like in my role, I mentioned I work with all 58 counties in California. And so there are some, very conservative areas in California. There are some very liberal areas in California. So trying to like, you know, take all of those different areas and speak with a unified voice on behalf of all those different folks can be difficult. But uh, and this is just in my experience, so this is not going to be everywhere. I'll preface it with that, but and I'll say I work in kind of social services area, so that could have something to do with it too. But I have seen more often than not. I feel like I'm sounding like really kind of like Pollyanna-ish, but I it's more often than not, people want to do good work, and they want to do what is going to have, a good societal impact. And so even I feel like more often than not, we can talking to each other, we can get to a place where folks can agree on some things, maybe not everything, but there's a good kind of landing place where we can do good work and have a good impact. So not saying that is the case everywhere, but I have found that more often than not in my work. So hopefully I don't sound too cheesy saying that, but
All right. It looks like Dr. Cobley might have responded in the chat, but a question that we had, Dr. Polk, if you want to give your input on this, is examples of science policy, a couple examples, and maybe how we could use our PhD training potentially, or even a master's to get into science policy.
yeah, and I'm kind of looking at what Lashe wrote in answer to that. But yeah, I think so. I worked in the legislature, and so there were a lot of bills coming through about regulations of different materials or kind of consumer products, things like that. And a lot, maybe not a lot of times, sometimes there were instances where either the proponents or opponents of a specific bill, they would kind of twist the research and they say, oh, we have research that shows X, Y, and Z. And for folks that didn't have that scientific background, they're like, oh, okay, great, you have scientific research that shows this. And in some of those cases, I was able to say, well, no, that's not really what this is showing. They're kind of twisting things a little bit, and actually, this is what it means, and this is not really supporting their argument. So that's kind of examples of how in my role in the legislature, where I kind of use that my science background and kind of put it to good use. Just having a better understanding of some of those, scientific terms and jargon and things like that, where I could kind of delve deeper into some of those things and give some better insight.
Perfect. And Olivia, thank you for patiently waiting. It looks like I've got you next as a hand raised with a question, so you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask.
Okay. Hi everyone. I have a kind of very highly specific question that I've been wondering about that I hope you can answer. So my question is, when you're in a fellowship or something like that, or you're working, let's say for a state government or federal government, does your personal like political affiliation matter? Like if you're a Democrat, are they only going to put you in the office of a senator or representative who's a Democrat, or does it not matter? Because that was something I've heard that like, oh, it's really hard for like Democrats to get a job in Washington right now or something or things along those lines. And I'm wondering like how true is that? Like, are they like screening you to check like what your views are? So I'd love any insight on that.
I can talk about this just specifically with like the excuse me, sorry. Specifically with the CCST fellowship that Lashe and I did. I actually know one of the other fellows that was in my cohort with me, who is very much not a Republican, was placed in a Republican office. So that's not, you know, at least for the CCST fellowship, that's not something that they're looking at. And I think because specifically for the fellowship program that we did, one of the kind of how they advertise, I guess, the fellowship is that it's what's the word I'm looking for? Sorry, impartial. And so in that case, then no, I don't think they're really kind of looking at your political beliefs. And even like wider in kind of state government, some of my colleagues working in state government, which in California very much blue, but I know like I have some colleagues that are very much Republicans and they work for state government. So at least in my experience, that has not been something that's been considered.
Okay, perfect. And it looks like the next person we have with a hand raise is Kenneth Pete. Oh, let's see. Kenneth, are you able to unmute to ask your question?
Maybe switch to Sean. You're on mute.
Oh, there we go. Okay. Zoom issues. Sorry, guys. The next person is going to be Sean.
Thank you. So something that I heard that Dr. Cobley had mentioned was how federal policies can influence state work. But something that I'm curious about is oftentimes the stake or the local constituencies know better about the impact that policies are having on their community. So how can someone at the local or state level help to influence the change in federal policy to better align either within their state or across the larger country?
Great question. So I will say that happens all the time, and I'm sort of biased in that we're in California. So a lot of times agencies in California might have existed before their federal counterpart. So like in California, it's really easy. That's hard because of right now. Before this year, it was easier to say the statement, but California can sort of go after more progressive or stronger rules than the federal government because our agencies existed before their federal counterparts. But usually you would just have to have a waiver. So you'd have to say, hey, feds, we want to do this thing. The federal government in the past historically would be like, yes, go ahead. And then what would happen is that you would sort of, for example, influence other states, right? So another state might say, oh, hey, California is doing these things and all of these things are already aligned and going. So now let's do it for our state. And that's sort of how you can get a shift nationally from one state. And the same thing happens at the local level, right? Like you might have a county that's doing really interesting progressive work, and then the state says, oh, that might make sense at the state level. And so it's a matter of like doing it well and getting enough eyes on it that it like speaks to each other. And I'm in meetings every day with people at different levels of government where we're trying to, again, we're all trying to solve the same problems. And so we're always consistently like speaking to each other and trying to integrate things that are going well. I should have said this at the beginning, but my ideas are all my own. I'm not speaking on behalf of my agency. Legally, I'm supposed to say that.
Thank you for that answer. I appreciate it.
Okay, it looks like a question that we have in the chat, and we've actually gotten this a couple times, is fellowship or science policy training at the state level to build your experience versus potentially the federal level, but any experience building at the state level.
So I will say during my PhD, I didn't do any policy work traditionally. I really focused on science communication, and science communication was how I sold myself, right? So it was like, I know how to take complicated information and say that to lots of different people. And then the way that I sold that was I taught seventh grade science for a year, which was science communication. I worked kind of like Renita, which I didn't know your Smithsonian example, but I also worked in a museum in the Natural History Museum and did a program through them. And so like science communication is sort of what was my ticket, I guess, into policy. I hadn't worked on policy directly. It's always how you sell yourself.
Dr. Polk, do you have anything to add on potential opportunities at the state level?
No, and I apologize, I missed the beginning of your original question. So I was responding to a question in the chat, so I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. We're all trying to multitask. So the question is really how to build experience at the state level. Any fellowships or trainings that you might be aware of that might be different from federal opportunities?
Oh, yeah. I thinking I'm not aware of like other I mean, aside from what we've mentioned several times is the CCST fellowship in here in California. And I do know there are a couple of other states that have similar programs in their state governments. Can't remember off the top of my head what those states are, but yeah, so, but I also would say kind of similar to what Lashe said, that you don't have to do like a policy fellowship there to kind of enter this world. There are various kind of ways that you can move into science policy. And I think we've mentioned this before too. I think that building that network, I think is very vital to kind of moving in that world. So just going back to what I said at the beginning, I think just reaching out to people, talking to people, building those connections, relationships, doing those informational interviews to learn about what people do, and kind of maintaining those connections, I think can go very far.
That's a really good point. So that's another time that network has come up. So definitely please everyone stay engaged with the National Science Policy Network, so NSPN, and also our speakers on the panel today. It looks like an additional question that Kenneth had was about work with tribal nations. Have you guys done work with any tribal nations?
Two things. So I want to answer the tribal question, but I want to address something that was in the chat about whether or not you need a PhD and how hard it is to do a PhD, or how hard it is to get jobs without PhDs. I think that's a really ripe topic. And what I've noticed is that most times on the job ad, it does not say out loud that you need a PhD, but oftentimes you're competing with PhDs for lots of reasons. And I will say that I've been on I've been on many a job panel, interview panel, where I've seen people with master's degrees outcompete PhDs because those PhDs don't know how to sell themselves. And I've been in other job panels where it's so hard, like you see someone who's doing so well, but they're just getting outcompeted by a PhD because that PhD has more experience and does know how to sell themselves. And so I think because all of those things can be true, it is a question truly of like, do you want to spend the 5 to 7 years getting a degree that's going to be difficult? Is there something for yourself that like you're going to need? Because whether or not it impacts the job market is like, who knows, right? Like just to say that you would get the PhD just to get a job that is not a professor, I think is like a really hard choice to make. And you might like, I mean, just to be blunt, like I spent 5 years post PhD before I could say I didn't regret getting that degree, right? Like it is not just a simple like I'm going to do this thing because it's going to land me a high paying job, because that's not true for everyone. And so I think it's a question of like, do you really want it for whatever reason? And is it actually going to get you what you need? Because it's not always the case. And I am sorry, Katie, that you're having trouble. Um, we should connect. It sounds like I might know people in your universe who could be helpful. So just want to say that. But then to the question of tribal work. So my agency, for example, does do a lot of tribal work. It's interesting because tribes are sovereign nations, and I think that a lot of times agencies will admit that they don't do that work well, but at least in California, it is a moment of people at least trying to recognize that like harm has been done, and to move past that harm, that you have to like take the work seriously and actually work with tribes as though they are sovereign nations, because they are. And so it's complicated, but I think the work is happening, starting to happen.
Perfect. Well, thank you both so much for joining us today. I do want to pass it back over to Annabelle just to kind of wrap up today. And also, if you guys are willing, we'll send you a follow-up email with requests for your links to your LinkedIn or email that we can share with everyone who is able to attend today. So I'll pass it back over to Annabelle. And again, thank you both for joining us today and sharing your knowledge with us.
Yes, thank you everyone, and thank you Kiara for moderating and for inviting Dr. Colby and Dr. Polk, and you as well, PS. Thank you so much. We invite you all to return tomorrow for day 2. We have 2 guest speakers, and their experience is in industry. So if you're interested in careers in industry, tomorrow's session will be perfect. Again, please connect with our speakers over LinkedIn. I'll send over an email with the resources that were talked about today. And we will have a recording on our YouTube channel. So go ahead and subscribe. And hopefully we'll see you back tomorrow. Thank you, everyone.